Glenn and Rick are going to be taking the next session, and I'm not exactly sure which order, but I'll introduce both of them at the same time. Rick, you're standing up first, so no. I'll just introduce Glenn first on my left and Rick on my right. Glenn is probably someone that many of you have heard speak before. He has been so helpful to us in the EFC, going back to, I'm going to say 1990 this time, but I could be wrong, the establishment of the Task Force on Education. Glenn chaired that task force. It became the Education Commission for about 10 years. And is very involved, has been for many, many years with Christian Direction Chrétienne in Montreal. He's going to be working with Rick Heimstra. Rick is a staff member with the EFC. He's the Director of Research and is now living in Ottawa, working out of the office in Ottawa. Just recently moved from the Markham office, so we are missing him in Markham. But Rick comes with a lot of experience as a high school teacher, someone who really enjoys stats, and so is perfectly qualified. But in addition to understanding stats, Rick has been a teacher and a pastor. And as a pastor, he understands a lot of the questions that are facing people in congregational ministry, and so brings that sensitivity to it. I'll leave the two of you to determine how you're going to do it.
It's good to be with you this afternoon. For those of you that were part of the President's Day last year, we met in Montreal and we spent the day reflecting on engaging the church, the mission of the church, the mission of God in the Quebec context. And that was a fun day, and so now to do it in Toronto and to reflect on the Canadian context provides us with another opportunity. Rick, out of his expertise, is going to crunch some numbers for us, and so I'm going to kind of bookend that with some preliminary reflections and the framework that we're going to use, and then after Rick's comments, I'll come up and propose some orientation that we might want to think about as we move through this conference together. As I was preparing, and I was thinking about how I wanted to do this with people that I know think about this issue all the time. What is the changing Canadian context in which we're doing ministry? I decided what I'd do, in part, is I'd pull a George Verwer on you. Now, there's a name out of the past for you. In fact, it was so much in the past that as I was flying down this afternoon, I knew it was Operation Mobilization. I had to lean over to TV and I'd say, TV, help me. Okay, part of memory going away. But I remember when I was a first-year university student, and I went for a conference at Wheaton College, and Verwer was speaking. And what did Verwer do? He always started every one of his conferences. He'd walk out with this great big pile of books, and he'd spend half of his time advertising books that weren't necessarily his or published by OM. And so what I, in part, want to do is introduce you to some authors that might give you some seminal thoughts on how we want to think about this issue together. For 1810, the wonderful British cobbler turned missionary, William Carey, proposed what you and I would call a global conference that would deal with the state of missions in the world at the turn of that century. He proposed that that conference would take place in Cape Town in South Africa. It never happened, but Stephen Neal, in his wonderful book, A History of Christian Missions, gives some time to describing what went into Carey's thoughts. It was for that reason that in the lead-up to the Edinburgh Conference that took place in 1910, that John Mott and his cronies, as I like to refer to them, decided that they would actually meet a century later to think about the global cause of the gospel. And through the incredible preparatory work of Mott that actually started in 1854, there was a movement to bring the church together to think about the cause of what Mott called the evangelization of the world in this generation. Preparatory conferences were held in London and New York, going back to 1854, 1860 in Liverpool, 1878 and 1888 in London, 1900 in New York, and then finally in 1910, 1,200 people, primarily people representing the missionary enterprise, met together at the Scottish Hall of Theology in Edinburgh to look at the issues. Here's how they defined their cause: to educate, inform, impress, sensitize Western churches to the urgency, the achievements, and the possibilities of the missionary enterprise. There were 8 great themes at that conference. Subsequently, they were published in Mott's book entitled The Decisive Hour in Christian Missions. There's a chapter dealing with carrying the gospel to the non-Christian world, another on the church and the mission field, education in relation to Christianization, message in relationship to other religions, preparation of missionaries, the home base, missions and governments, cooperation and promotion and unity in world evangelization. There's a couple fascinating pieces or things about this book. One is that the conference ended on June 12th, 1910. This book got published on June 26th, 1910. Mott knew how to get to the press really, really quickly. He also had a lot of time on boats to write, something that those of us today don't have. It's really been a loss in a lot of ways. But the other fascinating thing about this book is the map insert at the end. Because when you open the map, what Mott wanted to do was to show, and you can come up and look at this later, you won't see it now, but he wanted to show where the evangelization of the world was taking place. It's a fascinating map. All right, just lost it. But what's more interesting about the map, for what I want to say here, is that superimposed over the map is nothing less than the major trade routes of the world at Mott's time. Mott was a great believer that the way that the world was going to be evangelized in his generation was through nothing less than European progress. Now, what's wrong with what took place in Edinburgh also intrigues me. Because when you read through the deliberations, you read through this book, 2 things are absolutely stunning by what is not said. For any of you that have done any work in the history of the theology of mission, you know that even by the advent of the 20th century, German missiologists were already beginning to talk about Volk theology and missiology, premised on the idea that one of the great parts of mission work was to make sure that in moving in, particularly to Africa, you helped ethnic tribes not to intermarry. And that became an essential part. It was to become a defining moment of what was to split the church with the advent of the Nazi regime and Hitler's election in 1932. Any discussion on that is absent in the deliberations. The other thing that's totally absent is any indication that a decisive and divisive world war would take place 4 years after Edinburgh met. Any hint of nationalism on the horizon is only found in the deliberations. And as I was involved in getting ready for the Cape Town Congress, and we'll talk more about that, I was introduced to the writings of Nicolas Thibault. In his book, you might know it, The Black Swan. What is it in our thinking that blinds us to what should be evident? Thibault writes this about the Black Swan. He says, the central thesis of this book concerns our blindness with respect to the randomness, particularity, and the large deviations. Why do scientists or non-scientists, hotshots or regular Joes, tend to see pennies instead of the dollars? Why do we keep focusing on the minutiae and not the possible significant large events in spite of their obvious evidence and of their huge influence? And if you're following my argument, why does reading the daily newspaper actually decrease your knowledge of the world? Now, as an avid reader of 4 daily newspapers, I take that comment personally. But here's the point that I want us to go today. What are the black swans in our Canadian context which are blinding us so that we don't see the mission to which the triune God has called us? And Rick and I are going to try this afternoon to make some of those black swans a little bit more obvious. I want to begin with one preliminary reflection, and then we want to move in a somewhat hermeneutical fashion. I want to begin with just a short reflection out of a biblical text. So we start with the horizon of the text, or if you will, engaging the text. Then we want to move to the horizon of the church in the Canadian context, and Rick will unpack the numbers. After he talks, I'll have a couple of short reflections, which then will lead us into the third horizon, which is the horizon, our engagement as God's people in Canada with our context. Let me just begin with one short preliminary reflection. It has to do with how we appropriate, as the church, social science research. In other words, is there a proper way that we can appropriate social science research and use it and understand it in our context? Let me just make 4 quick points here. We can get into this more in the dialogue if you want. I think one thing that we always need to remember when we're dealing with social science research is that we are dealing with descriptive, not normative statements. Social science does not carry normative behavior or normative summary statements. Social science describes. Second of all, and probably very important for what we want to do this afternoon, social science research defines what is real in social consequences, and therefore says it must be taken seriously. But it's what's real in social consequences. Now, you might understand this in other terms of, what is people perceive has to be taken real. Now, sometimes the real is going to be bracketed. But the point being is that what is defined as real in social consequences must be taken seriously. Third, what does social theory try to do? Social theory merely tries to make explicit what the social actors are living implicitly. And part of what we want to do today is to make some things explicit that people are living implicitly. And then finally, and I say this with a caution about all social science theories and research, social science will always be looking both at causes and conditioning. And sometimes, if we look too much into the environment, we see conditioning as being determinative. And sometimes, when we're just into causal, then we're becoming the ultimate individualists. And so, whenever we're trying to appropriate social science research, we need to remember we need to keep the balance of both causes and conditioning. Now, in light of our subject this afternoon, I thought about how does the church engage the text, the biblical text? What is the horizon that we want to look at? TV, Terry LeBlanc, and I are part of the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. This past weekend with Jerry, we had a wonderful board meeting. It's one of the most fun experiences I have year in and year out serving on that board. And we did a manuscript Bible study on Saturday morning in Matthew chapter 15. I decided to save TV and Terry from going through the exercise. I picked another one. Because it's quite common when we talk about the context today to go into the language of being strangers and exiles in our situation. I've decided to stick with it nonetheless. And as I was reflecting about this context and how the church engages that context, those metaphors are well worth considering again, but for another reason. Listen to what St. Peter wrote in his first epistle, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. Peter, an apostle of Christ Jesus, to the exiles of the dispersion living in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood. Exile language would have been appropriate for the readers of this text because they were living as Jews in the diaspora. They were part of that 90% of the Jewish population of this time that was living outside of Palestine. We know that there were easily 40,000 of them living in Rome. There were better than 1 million living in Egypt. But the vast majority of Jews at that time were living in the shame of diaspora out of the Jewish story in the Jewish texts. But it's into that situation that Peter explains something magnificent and significant to these refugees, to these chosen sojourners. Because he says that they have been chosen, how? According to the foreknowledge of God the Father. This deliberate counsel of God that comes out of his own omniscience. Where does that take place? With the operative conjunction, it's in the sphere of the sanctifying Spirit. It's not located in a specific geography. It's located in the sphere of the sanctifying Spirit. And the outcome is with a view to obedience and consecration in Jesus Christ. And so Peter is saying something very significant to these people in their state. He's saying the God who is beyond this world, one being, one substance, one essence, is very active in his three subsistencies, in his three persons, in his three modes of being, in a way in which salvation is ordered in the world. God relates to the world, according to Peter, not just in the unity of his divine being, but in his ongoing interaction as a work in three persons in the world. And so this knowledge of this God as exiles, as chosen sojourners, is not just propositional general knowledge of this triune God, but this is a knowledge of God, his being in action. And so as we come to our theme today, if we're going to engage the horizon of the text and to take metaphors like chosen sojourners and exiles and aliens seriously in our context, that's why we don't just need to have a theology of mission, but we need to have a missional theology. Now, the question of the witness of God in the world, this God in his being in action, is really a problem that God has. How does this triune God work in the world? Now, those of you like me that have done all our theological education and our seminary education, you've been in those debates like I've been. Do we serve God on behalf of the world, or do we serve the world on behalf of God? Is it God church world? Is it God world church? We go round and round, and I say, dingbat on all of it. You see, God has reconciled all of this in himself. You see, it's rooted in the triune God's undivided being in action. This Trinitarian understanding of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit means that God in God's very nature is apostolic. And so this apostolic God works in the world in community, in his own community. But the problem of witness with God can only be resolved by not separating God's mission from the church's existence and purpose. And so therefore, as we go through this time today and this week, it does not suffice just to say that God is missionary. No, we need to understand that this is the triune God in action. This is the triune God who in his very nature is apostolic, and he invites us into his being and therefore into his mission. And that makes being in exile, being a chosen sojourner, being a resident alien, so different. We could actually put it this way. It is the Church of Jesus Christ as a missionary church that is sent out into the world, or it is not at all. And as we go through our time this week, let us think not just about a theology of mission, but about a missional theology that is located in the triune God, who, as Peter says, has chosen these sojourners according to his creatorhood, located in the sanctifying work of the Spirit, but for the purpose of obedience to King Jesus. Now, with that said, let me turn it over to Rick, who will now take us through what is the engagement of the church in the Canadian context. What's going on that make our reflection new and fresh today? Rick.
I'm going to be talking about stats, and imagine that I'm very powerful, sort of like the big bulge here. And I want you to think about stats this way. We're talking about social science stats, but to see where it benefits, imagine that I was very powerful and there was this fast-flowing river here, and I could just pick you up and drop you into that river. And as you sputter and you come up to the top and you look around and try and figure out what you're going to do, one of the first things you want to do is sort of to assess the stream and the flow and where it's going and decide whether you're going to try to swim to one shore, you're going to try and plant your feet and and stay there, go one way or the other. And that's what we're going to do with stats today. The stats is more like identifying flows and trends. So you're going to see a lot of numbers. Don't pay attention so much to the numbers as the trends, to see which way it's going. Again, as Glenn said, these aren't normative, but they help us to understand where the culture is going and where it's changing. And so some of these topics, they're snapshots of different facets of where we find ourselves in the Canadian context. Think about where you're at. Compare what you're experiencing with what social scientists have found. If you're interested in the numbers are there. Watch the direction. I can send these to you later if you're interested. So, first off, Reginald Bibby, he's a sociologist at the University of Lethbridge. He has been asking youth about their religious affiliation. That's the religion that they identify with since about the mid-70s. This stats look at 1984 to 2008. Here's what he's found about the changes. This red line here is the change in Protestant religious identity. That includes evangelicals and mainline. Since between 1984, we're at 35%. Now we're down to 13, okay? This is what gets Reg the nickname Bad News Bibby. Okay, also Roman Catholics going down. What the other trends that we see is that we've got no faith at all that are going up, as well as other faiths. This other faith is a combined Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, everything else combined, okay? That's some of the trends that we're seeing. On the front of immigration, here's where immigration's coming from. In 1981, most of our immigration was coming from Europe. That's this blue. I want you to see how this immigration from Europe, if we project out to 2013, is tightening up. And what's growing? Immigration from Asia. Why is this important? Because most of the immigrants that come from Asia are not Christians. They're either Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, or Hindus, okay? This alone is going to change Canada. There's approximately 270,000 immigrants that come into Canada each year. Most of them are not Christian. In fact, if we look at how the immigration by religious affiliation has changed, just since 1961 up until 2001, that's the time of the last census, we see that this blue represents the change in Protestant religious immigration. And you can see here that this is getting close to 40% in 1961 were Protestant. Now it's down about 10% in 2001, and it has probably shrunk. It's probably shrunk. We have declines also in Roman Catholics and among all different Christian groups. The ones that are growing here are, again, Muslims, Hindu, Buddhists, and Sikh. We expect that because that's also where the immigration is growing, from the parts of the world where those are the religious majorities. Another one that is growing, not quite as strong as those that say they have no religious affiliation at all. This alone is going to change our context. If we look at the 2001 and the projected 2017 visible minority populations, why do we look at this? Because I want to show you that there's some visible minority populations that are growing very quickly. One is Chinese, South Asian, Black, Filipino. These are the fast-growing ones. What I've tried to outline here, based on the 2001 census data with this black line, is the percentage of those populations that identify with an evangelical Christian tradition. What you are going to see is that in the fastest growing visible minority populations, evangelicals are very poorly represented. Very poorly represented. What it means is that as the country changes, our proportion of the country, our percentage of the population is going to shrink unless something changes. Again, this is descriptive, this is not normative, this can change. If we look at major cities in Canada and their visible minority populations, in the blue line is 2001, the green line is the projected populations in 2013. You can see that in all the major cities in Canada, it's projected to grow, if not close to double. Again, the exact numbers aren't important. Look at the differences in those bars as we go across. We have Toronto here. 63% of the population is expected to be visible minorities, which makes them visible majorities, right? The visible minorities become the white people in Toronto by 2031. Other social trends that are changing, and we all know this. This is comparing 1976 with 2008. Families where the husband or the wife were single wage earners. 1976, over half of households had a single wage earner where it was the husband, only 4% of the wife. The biggest difference to see here is not how much the husband has dropped by 2008, it's that if you combine the single wage earning families, it's about 30%, both husband and wives. That means that most families are dual wage earners now. And if we look at the families with children in the home, we see that this is again 1976 comparing with 2008, that even families with very young children, most of those families are dual wage earner families. Creates all kinds of time stress on families. Has all kinds of implications for things like who volunteers in your church. It has all kinds of implications for things like, do you get involved in bowling leagues, baseball, the Lions Club, church youth group, because families are working. Looking at charitable donations, this is something that we're interested in. This looks at tax filings, and this looks at just the amount that donors give. That's the people who give something. And we see that this line represents the percentage of the Canadian population that gives anything at all to any kind of charity. It's going down. It's going down fairly consistently. It fell again for 2008, this last available year. Now, the amount that the donors, the people who are still giving, gave was going up until about 2007. Now, we're skipping every other year to stay with the even years here. But by 2008, even those that were giving started to go down. That means that fewer people are giving, and the ones that are giving, for the first time in recent memory, are giving less. This is CanSim data from your tax forms. If we analyze that and look at who are the people, so if people are giving less, who's giving less? If this is the percentage decline between 2006 and 2008, we see that it's those people between ages of 25 and 34 between 2006 and 2008, they declined in their giving by 18%. 18% over 2 years. Now, maybe it's because the recession hit those groups the hardest. You see that those that are 65 and older, they're actually giving a little bit more. What is going to happen if those giving patterns continue? Because people, when they get into a giving pattern, they continue with their habit. Now, this again is similar data. It only goes to 2007. This was the golden year with giving, okay? Things changed after 2007 and giving patterns started to change. What I want you to notice here, this is a sociological fact, is that those who attend weekly, that's the blue line, give a lot more than those that don't attend weekly. And that means those who attend a couple times a month versus every week. If we look at now this data here, looks at your charitable information returns that congregations submit to the government. And if we're looking at the difference between 2007 and 2008 growth in liabilities, that's mostly your debts, that's mostly your mortgage, that's that kind of thing. And what I thought I would end up doing, because churches have grown a little bit, to see how much did they grow. And so what we represent here is this is 0 to 25% growth in your debt over that time period. And you see that it's going to spike here. Now, if your debts are growing enormously, that's probably because you have a building program, okay? But if it's growing just a little bit, and there's a lot of churches where it's growing just a little bit, this is an indication of the kind of stress that's going on in our congregation's finances. Interestingly enough, our offerings held steady over that time period. Up till 2009, it's almost as if you don't see the recession at all. Okay, total revenue did fall though, and that means that probably there's some of the big churches with investments where their numbers are coming down. Average hours volunteered, you can see that again we're comparing the green, which those who don't attend weekly with those who do. Those who attend weekly, for all kinds of good reasons, if you're in church, you're encouraged to volunteer. They volunteer more. That's going up. We don't have numbers beyond 2007, but perhaps that's coming down. Just if we look at the context of volunteer hours, as you get older, you tend to volunteer more, but then there's participation rate. There are fewer people that volunteer. That's probably a function of how your health is affecting your volunteering. This is a really interesting study. In 2005, the Stat Canada, the General Social Survey, asked people how they spent their time. And one of the things they said is, tell me where you're spending your time and how much time you're spending there. Canadians increasingly are spending a lot of time at home. Now, even if you take this bit off, that's the time they spend sleeping, it's still an enormous amount of time spent at home. And what we're finding is that increasingly as people's time crunch happens, that they spend a lot of time at home, a lot of time at work, and not much time in their other social things. This is the interesting one. The average Canadian spends about 20 minutes a week in a place of worship. Just 20 minutes a week in a place of worship. Now think about what that means for all those programs that you're planning at a place of worship. Again, religious attendance, it's been on a very linear decline since 1985. That includes all faiths. It's probably down around 18% right now. Eventually that'll bottom out because the immigrants coming in are more religiously observant than us, right? The people who have declined the most are those boomers. They're the ones that are opting out on the greatest level. Again, we're looking for broad strokes, right? You can get the numbers later. Social networking is changing what we're doing here. 56% of Canadians in 2009 had a social networking profile. That is growing enormously. 18 months before this poll was taken, it was 39%. It's probably up around 60-70% right now. We'll just skip over that slide. We're short on time. I want you to see that Canadians increasingly are looking to the internet and other mediated technologies to do all kinds of things in their lives. This survey looked at where people go to for help, and it turns out they go to their family and their friends most of all. But the next thing is, this green bar here represents the internet. And increasingly they're using social networking sites to meet their family and friends to get that kind of help. But there's other slides here. We see that teens, Reg Bibby found that 43% of Canadian teens spend 3 or more hours a day on the internet or social networking technologies. An Ipsos Reid poll asking people about how much time do you spend on the internet. I want you to just look at this big bar here. This is age 19 to 24, 45 hours a week on the internet doing various things. That's a full work week plus overtime. And if you think about it, that sounds crazy. But then if you think about the people you know, that has a ring of truth to it. Increasingly, our lives are geared towards these things and internet technologies. Another recent survey, the change in growth in internet activities. You see, look at medical advice. People are going to the internet for medical advice. Downloading television. Television is merging there. And again, I'm going quickly here. This was a 2005 General Social Survey, and it's old news here, right? It was comparing the amount of time that people spend on the internet versus television. And you can see that the red here is the computer time, this is television time. By 2009, internet time had overtaken television for Canadians. Had overtaken television. People are spending more time on the internet than on television. This is the growth in mobile-oriented text messages, an exponential growth year by year. That's one sent from devices like this. In 2010, we are on track to exceed 51 billion text messages a year. That's 153 million text messages per day and 197 text messages per subscriber per month. You think about that. All of that is time where increasingly your lives are going through a little screen like this. And that is changing how people think, and it's changing how they be in the world. Last slide here. Advertisers are moving their advertising dollars away from print, radio, and television to mobile device, email, and online advertising. This is changing the context in which we do ministry. I'll just say one more comment about the way the social networks are working here. Increasingly, what people are doing is they have an intense set of relationships with the core of their friends that are very close to them, that they see every day. And then there's another bunch of friends that they connect with through social networks. And if you think about it in terms of a fountain, in a fountain the water will come up through a central core and then it will spill over, right? The places right close to the core will stay dry. And that's what's happening in all these proximate structures like churches, like bowling leagues and everything else, are getting crowded out of people's lives as they stay connected to their core and to those that they connect with on their social networks that are far away.
Again, you'll have a few minutes to engage Rick on some of that data. The horizon of the text, our horizon, with what Rick has said, let me complement it with just two other brief thoughts about our context. Before then, we talk about the engagement or the horizon of the church in this situation as we move to the next part of our conference. Many of you are familiar with the work of Charles Taylor. I've had a privilege of working with him over the last couple of years on things related to hyper-individuality and secularity. I think are two things that come out of the data that, again, are part of our context. If any of you plowed through The Sources of the Self, Taylor's work in 1989, you're reminded that he uses terms like expressive individualism, the self-sufficing individualism, exclusive individualism or humanism, the buffered self. The point that Taylor wants to make is that in our Canadian context today, the culture of authenticity, as he calls it, is one in which meaning in life is centered in the human person. And that has now become part of what's going on globally. Now, in a real sense, lots of people in the church want to decry that. But there's an interesting part of Taylor's argument that he develops in the last chapter of his most recent book, A Secular Age, where he gives the stories of people who turn from this expressive individualism and return to the roots of faith. In one sense, it shouldn't surprise us, because so much of Christian faith has been in this triune God speaking to his people and to individuals. There's a fascinating thing taking place right now in French-speaking Europe. An amazing number of journalists in particular, but also academics, are now coming back to faith by discovering the roots of individualism in the Christian tradition. One of these is Jean-Claude Guillabard. He is the former foreign correspondent with Le Monde newspaper. He's now the editor of one of France's major publishing companies. He wrote the book, Pourquoi je suis redevenu chrétien? Why I re-became a Christian. There are other authors like this. The point being, this hyper-individuality is actually an opportunity for people to reconnect with the Christian story. Now, the other point that Taylor likes to make is found in his book, A Secular Age. Taylor, in his marvelous book, moves beyond the debates of secularism and secularization, and he coins the term secularity. It's the changing in the conditions in which our society is grounded. And he coins the term as well, the eminent frame, where we've moved from a world in which 500 years ago it was impossible not to believe, to an era today where it is virtually impossible to believe. And he charts that. But again, rather than it being a cause for dismay, Taylor makes the point that people are reconnecting with the transcendent. As he says, you can't just slough off the transcendent in the secularity of our era. And so this context within which we find ourselves, the numbers as Rick has crunched them for us, but also in this age of secularity and hyper-individuality, actually presents new opportunities for the church, and let's move to the third horizon, to engage the context. And let me conclude my thoughts this afternoon with 5 reflections, 5 suggestions if you want, 5 things that we might want to think about this week as we think about how we're going to engage our context as we've described it. In other words, what does it mean for us to be these chosen sojourners, these aliens, these strangers and foreigners in this context that we're going to talk about this week? What does it mean for the church to engage and to be truly missional copycats of the triune God in the world? Let me give you 5 possible areas to reflect on. I think one that we need to take seriously is that it's high time for us to engage like-minded, biblically informed followers of Jesus in our neighborhoods and in our situations. The divisive debates between Protestants and Catholics, Orthodox and Coptic Christians, Baptists and us Mennonites, those days, my friend, in our context, must be challenged. And I would like to suggest that we need to think about new terminology on how we will engage as like-minded, biblically informed followers of Jesus as we think about this context. I would like to suggest that we're going to find new friends. We're going to find new colleagues. We're going to find new opportunities for ministry. The divisions of the past, even the divisions we've created as quote-unquote evangelicals, those divisions will fall as we begin to engage like-minded, biblically informed followers of Jesus in our communities. A second area where I think we can probably afford to do more reflection. What does it mean for our local congregations to be the entity that is interpreting the triune God in our neighborhoods? What does it mean in light of the ongoing marginalization of the social significance of faith? What does it mean for the local congregation to be that entity that interprets God in our situation? In other words, it's going to be the local congregation. It's going to be the local Bible study. It's going to be the cell group in the marketplace. These are going to be the first Bible that people will read. And as we think about our context, how do we be that entity? How do we be that entity in action that is interpreting the triune God in our changing Canadian context? Third, where we need to think is about how are we going to bear witness to the God of Jesus and all of his teachings in word and deed in our context. In this era that Rick has described for us, what does it mean to bear witness to the God of Jesus, to all of his teachings, but to do it in word and deed? How are we going to move beyond the nomenclature and the language of a personal relationship with Jesus? This language must go so that we begin to communicate to people, what does it mean to follow the God of Jesus? All of his teachings, but we communicate that in word and deed. We become the entity that interprets that God in our situation. Recently, I was with a group of people who were complaining to me, and they asked for my help, and they said, you know, Glenn, we're really, really good at evangelism, but we're really crummy at discipleship. Can you help us out? I don't think I was very helpful because I said, if you have a problem with discipleship, then it would seem to me, biblically speaking, you have a problem with the gospel. You have a problem with discipleship. And so therefore, our problems of witness are really problems with the God, this triune God that we serve. Fourth, I think we need to have new reflections as well about spiritual formation, Christian education, discipleship, down to earth Monday to Friday spirituality. What are we doing to help people reconnect with the living Spirit and how they interpret then God in their situation? I sat with a group of men and women in a company in downtown Montreal at noon yesterday. It's a wonderful group of people that have come to follow Jesus over the course of the last 3 years, primarily through one of their colleagues almost dying when she was on vacation in France. And she is healed now, but this group came together because they discovered that Jesus healed. And they discovered that they could, as Christians, explain that to their colleagues. And they went from a small little Bible study that met on Monday at noon to now a group of 15 people that meets at noon. But yesterday they were wrestling with wealth. They were wrestling with Mark 10. They were wrestling with what does it mean as business and professional people to follow Jesus. My friends, those are the types of conversations we want to promote for our parishioners and our lay people, with all the problems that word implies, right across our Canadian context. So fresh reflections about spiritual formation, Christian education, discipleship, and down-to-earth, week in, week out spirituality. And then finally, probably the area that touches close to my own heart is, what are we doing in theological education? Bringing together preaching and teaching that touches both heart and head. One of the things that I learned from Charles Taylor was how much my own faith was, as he would call it, excarnational. We as Protestants have done a marvelous job of developing people from the neck up. We have people who know but don't incarnate. And on more than one occasion, Taylor said, yeah, the problem with you Protestants is that you're excarnational. Now, I had my own little comments for him about his non-Augustinian Catholicism, but that's a different issue. But the point is, my friends, if we're going to be teaching people, particularly in our theological institutions, about preaching and teaching the Scriptures, bringing together heart and head, we need to promote fresh expressions of incarnational living. But that's not just about witness, that's about life. And that's about being copycats of this triune God in the world, never divorcing the purpose and mission of the church from who God is as the triune creator.